We spent today here in Windsor talking about the growth of the North American supply chain, the growth of the Canadian supply chain. I'm curious, you sat through these conversations, as an American in a Canadian context. What did you take away? What did you hear today that resonated, and what can you take back with you to your colleagues in the U.S.?
Lots of projects across North America that present an opportunity to regionalize the supply chain for minerals and batteries and electric vehicles in a way that, when we're talking about a decades-long time frame, make a ton of sense, both economically, politically, from a national security and a regional security standpoint. I heard many of the same questions being asked about what is the next best step, what are the big ideas for federal policy that can, set Canada up for success, and a lot of similar ideas about how to support the entrepreneurial spirit, take companies from early stage to, becoming mature businesses that stay in Canada, that produce here. How do you encourage that and incentivize that? And I think there's a huge opportunity presented by the regionalization of a lot of parts of the supply chain in the United States, and particularly upstream mineral and battery component production, where there seems to be a ton of energy and focus on that here in Canada. And I think there would be a ton of support from the rest of the North American supply chain for that type of long-term investment.
Obviously in the U.S. things are changing. There's the politicization of this industry. How does ZETA approach this? Is there kind of a common sort of thread that you can bring to different political actors and try to make them understand that this is an industry of the future that can really be the backbone of the U.S. economy and the U.S. sector?
My perspective on this is, as someone who spent 7 years in this industry before coming to ZETA, almost 2 years ago, and that spanned multiple administrations in the United States, and went through a lot of the same fluctuations at a company level that we're now seeing at the industry level. And I think one of the mottos that I sort of live by is don't panic, don't react to the short-term trend or the news cycle, even if sometimes the dips and the fluctuations can be longer than is comfortable to ride through. But this is a dramatic change in the transportation sector. It's not just vehicles, it's infrastructure, it is the power sector. It involves big investments that are both private sector but also from regulated industries that have different sets of criteria that they need to justify big transformational investments. I'm talking about the utility sector, and that rely on big commitments, big policy structures. So all of that is happening. Sometimes things are happening below the surface that enable future growth, but that don't show up in the day-to-day data. And I think that's where we've been for the last year or so.
And to kind of accelerate the adoption of these technologies, we were talking earlier today about the role that education plays, right? And trying to connect people's purchasing decisions with the local economy. So if things are made in their region or in their city or in their town, they may be more likely to buy that product. And you think about in Detroit, just across the river here. I mean, you wouldn't buy any vehicle that wasn't made in Detroit. And so at some point, if you can onshore more of the supply chain to North America, you're going to get more buy-in, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, I think as an American cars really meant something for a long time. I grew up in a family that only drove cars that were made in America. I think that has become It's still important in a lot of places in the United States, but I think I'll give one statistic. 74% of the EVs sold in the United States last year were made in the United States.
Right.
Now, if you were to poll people in the United States, how many do they think were made there? I think they'd give a much lower number because they've heard different.
Sure.
One of the things that we've been doing through ZETA Education Fund, which is our 501c3, and we just launched a $1.3 million campaign today focused on a few states, Tennessee, Arizona, and Georgia, where EV adoption isn't nearly as high as it is in California or New York or even Florida, but there is a huge wave of investment in manufacturing in those states, and as you just said, when people know that their local economy, either their state economy or their local economy, their community, has a real stake in making either in mineral refining, in battery component manufacturing, batteries, EVs, then they sort of, whether or not they plan to drive an EV anytime soon, they instantly are resistant to some of the real bad faith talking points against EVs, and in general are very open to all of the true facts about electric vehicles and the benefits that they bring to the community, to the country, or to the region in this case.
And on this question, and maybe kind of lever off of what you just said, if you cast your mind out to call it 2040 or 2050, let's say 2050, what does good look like, right? For the US, for North America, in terms of, yes, uptake, but in terms of kind of an industry that is, continental in nature, and how a couple quick thoughts on how we can get there, what needs to happen next?
The first place my mind goes in 2050 timeline is that zero emission vehicles have really undergone a major wave of adoption and have started to turn over the vehicle fleet, and that in conjunction with more renewable energy, more zero carbon energy in the power sector, we've started to decarbonize the light duty and medium and heavy duty transportation sectors. Right. I think that is what motivates a lot of people in this work. Now, we're not an environmental organization, but I do think that that's important. That is a guiding, a North Star for a lot of people. A lot of people have started companies in this sector. But from a full supply chain standpoint, I think I would love it if North America had a fully developed supply chain for vehicles, batteries, that we were recycling batteries at the end of life and recovering 30% of our mineral supply from recycled batteries, which is what most experts believe is what we can achieve. And that along with mining is continuing to power an energy transition, but also that we've started to develop some of these really hard to develop parts of the supply chain, like cathode active materials, cathodes, anodes, in North America, that have long lead times, that are challenging to get built, for which we do have a market outside of China, within allied countries, but that a lot of these companies from Japan and South Korea are actively investing in North America to be able to build with us here. I think that's what success looks like to me. That's the hardest thing right now. Right. And so the thing that I think on a 10, 15-year timeline would mean success for me.